This is Peter,
And this is Tom.
and you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcasts. All right. So, my name is Peter, and I'm a history teacher.
My name is Tom. I'm also a history teacher.
So, Tom and I have met. We met at college, actually, about more than 15 years ago. I've been teaching for 15 years. So, we
Yep.
met in college about 20 years ago. We met in a history class where we worked on a project together on Pearl Harbor. And we've been friends ever since. And we just kind of came up. We decided to make a podcast.
Pretty much. Yep.
Pretty much, right? So, a few things we need to get out of the way first. First is that we are not professional podcasters, although I really don't know if anyone really was a professional podcaster at first. They kind of just became professional podcasters. So we're not professional podcasters. So everyone just bear with us. Another thing I kind of want to get out of the way is that we want to make this family friendly.
Family friendly, exactly. So we're not going to have cursing, hopefully, and things like that. We're also going to try to stay away from being overly political. All right. You're not really going to know our total opinions. We're kind of just going down the middle here because this is for students and as well as families. Right, Pete?
Indeed. And I guess that's the whole premise is that, now with coronavirus going on and, some people not being in school and not going back to school, I guess we kind of miss having a banter, talking back and forth about history. So this was just another outlet where we could do that. So anything else you want to get out of the way? I think that's it, right?
I think that covers everything for now. We can always figure it out as time goes on.
Yeah. Also, we're not really planning these in any particular order. Tom and I usually talk about history, comic books. We talk about movies. We talk about everything. Kind of like what we talk about with our students in our class as well. But there is no chronological order to any of these topics. It's kind of just whatever comes up that we want to talk about. And that's kind of how we're going to be doing these. So, Tom, you want to kind of introduce what we're doing today?
So today we, since it's the first podcast, figure we'd go with the person who was often called first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And that would be none other than George Washington.
Indeed. So, George Washington. What we kind of want to do today is we want to talk about George Washington in a sense of not like the textbook version of George Washington, but like who really was George Washington. Interestingly enough, I was just reading recently about his death. It's kind of a weird way to start it, but
start with the end. There you go, Pete. Start with the
end, right? Interesting enough, I mean, he died, when he was in his 60s. He was not old at all.
It was 67, I believe, right, when he died?
Yep, yeah. So not old by any means in today's standards. And what's interesting is he basically got an infection of the throat. If there was antibiotics,
he would have been fine. Yeah, but then he went outside. He went outside like surveying what trees he wanted to get cut down or whatever. And then he got sick and he didn't change. Well, he got wet because it was like sleeting and he didn't change his clothes because he had people coming over. He didn't want them to wait. That's something you have to understand. Washington was so popular even after his presidency. People were constantly coming to Mount Vernon just to like pay their respects and like see him. So there were always people waiting for him. So he just rushed and didn't get changed and stayed in his wet clothes, which definitely made the situation a lot worse.
Absolutely. So, he contracted a fever, and after his fever, basically, infection of the throat. So he was bedridden, and then they had a great idea on how to make him better.
That's the best idea ever. Yeah, the best idea ever.
So they basically bled him.
Over 5 pints of blood.
Out of like the 8 or whatever he had, or 9, whatever we have. Yeah,
it just made him weaker and weaker.
Yep, and then at one point they thought they were going to relieve some pressure on his throat because of the throat infection, so they actually like cut his throat a little bit, which did not help the situation.
Yeah, they were going to do that. What's that called when they cut the throat? Tariq.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, they were going to do that, but I read about that too. And the doctor like wasn't sure how to do it. None of them knew how to do it, so they just like, oh, let's stop. So they stopped like halfway through. So like, imagine that, like they're doing surgery. We know, has anyone done this before? No. Maybe we shouldn't do it. All right, let's cut him and make him bleed some more then instead. And that was basically what they were doing to this guy for like the last couple of days there, as he was pretty much like
which is insane. Which is insane. I mean, if you look at some of these other presidents too, it's insane.
Well, the weird thing about Washington too, if you look at his like just his his life, he had like a lot of diseases over his parts of his life, and this is what actually killed him was basically like a cold that kept on getting worse. The guy had smallpox, right, when he was younger.
Yep.
He had dysentery several times. He had like typhoid fever, like pretty much all those like horrible things from that time he had at some point or another. And finally, he gets done in by pretty much like a cold that just got worse and worse and worse. So it was weird. They said he was hard to kill. Like he had two during the wars that he fought in, he had two horses shot out from under him. He had his like bullets went through his coats all the time, and he always survived. And finally, he gets killed basically from medical malpractice from a throat infection.
Which is insane. There's actually an interesting story. I'm sure you're right about that too. That and just for future reference, so Tom and I don't actually research this together. We kind of research our things separately, and then
And we
we
just
first time we
talk
talk.
about what we kind of know, just as being
Yeah,
teachers
basically
for the
we kind of
past 15, 16 years.
indeed. So we kind of get here together and just talk. You know, we never really discussed this beforehand. But what's interesting is Washington was afraid that if he maybe wouldn't die for some reason, he didn't want to be buried alive.
Yeah, that was
So
a big fear back then, right?
yeah, that was his thing. So he made sure that he told him that before you bury
Yeah.
me, like kind of leave me to
3
the
days.
side.
Yeah, 3 days
Yeah,
before you bury me. Make sure I'm dead.
yeah. Tom, have you ever been to Mount Vernon?
No, I've never been to Mount Vernon. I think we might
Yes,
have. No, no. I know I've never been there. I think if we ever drove past it for anything, but no. Nothing.
yes, I've been to Mount Vernon a few times, and it's really nice to kind of visit. There's so many people that visit his grave. But interesting story about his grave. Once they actually buried him in there, it was not a nice concrete made grave, and it was right by
No.
Potomac River, and it would flood all the time. And actually, for like the first 30 years, um, literally that entire um, burial place would flood. They said that there was coffins just kind of swimming in water and bones everywhere. And luckily, Washington was fine. His body was fine because they kind of built like a pedestal for him.
Yeah.
But all of his other family members would literally like just
Washed away.
washed away around
I
it.
read about there was
Um,
also a conspiracy to try to steal his skull. You see that one?
yeah, they did. Yep.
They tried to steal, but they stopped the guy. That's like, all right, we have to do something. Make sure that people don't try to like grave rob this guy. Something happened with. Well, I'm sure we can talk about later. With Lincoln, his body
Oh
was
yeah.
stolen too for a while.
Yep. Yep. His
People like
body is
president's bones. People like president's bones. I don't know what it
it's
is.
interesting. I mean, it was really interesting with Washington too. Like they tried to steal his skull because it was actually the gardener that was in
Yeah,
charge of
disgruntled, right? He was mad about what
yeah,
he was.
he was mad because he was being fired because clearly he didn't do a good job since like the body was swimming all the time every time it rained. Um, so that was pretty much it for Washington. And then after that is when they kind of solidified it and put in concrete, and it looks as pretty as it does today. But Washington, just kind of a few things about Washington. You know, we guess we'll talk a little bit about what he did as president, what he's kind of known for, but then we'll get into the some of the misconceptions about Washington. Namely, a lot of people believe that Washington wanted to only run for president for 2 terms, and then he said, that's undemocratic. I want to step down. But really, I mean, the story is a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, like anything else, it's a lot more than just what the history books or just what you're going to see googling him and things of that. There's a lot more information out there, and it's a very interesting case. He's really you see like the politics of the time, him because like Peter said, you were saying there, Pete, like he also didn't even want to be president at all. Like that was just
Nope.
something like they knew that he wasn't going to turn it down because he felt like it was like his duty. That was a big thing with Washington, like his duty, his honor. That was a big thing with him. But like he had no interest whatsoever. He was very happy in his retirement after the Revolutionary War, even though
Well,
he
he was
was
filthy
failing.
rich. I mean, this guy was,
Well,
they
was he
said he
though?
was.
Because I was reading a
Towards
lot of
the
those.
end, yeah,
Yeah,
towards the end he wasn't. Yeah, towards the end, actually, when he came back from the presidency, his estate was basically
even yeah,
going
because
bankrupt.
he never got paid during the
Yeah,
Revolutionary War, and they were supposed to pay him back, and they did a little bit, whatever.
yeah,
And pretty much Mount Vernon like never really turned a profit until he started selling whiskey.
yep. Towards
I
the
think
end, yeah,
that's when he
yeah,
started
yeah.
making. That's when he started making money. He still had money. This guy was not going to be on the streets by any stretch of the
No,
imagination.
the amount
And
of
most
land he
of
owned.
he said he didn't have
Actually,
a lot of like liquid assets. He didn't have a
yeah.
lot of liquid assets. He had a lot of like just land.
It's interesting. Forbes did a an article years back. The wealthiest presidents of all time accounted for inflation, and George Washington is number one still,
Yeah.
the wealthiest president. What's interesting is that on that in that article, John Kennedy has like an asterisk next to his name because some of the money was illegit, like not legitimate,
Oh, I'm
which is
sure. Yeah.
kind of interesting. But So when Washington became president, kind of like Tom was saying, he didn't really want to be president, and they really actually wanted Ben Franklin initially. It was either him or Ben Franklin, and Ben Franklin was super old, and he had arthritis and everything else, and too much partying, and, he kind of didn't want to do it. And that's when, obviously the next choice was Washington. So he got 69 out of 69 electoral college votes. You know, the only president ever to get that.
Yeah, twice. He did it twice,
Yeah.
obviously. They
You know
also
what's
knew that
interesting?
if
Go ahead.
what's up? Good.
No, no. I was saying what's interesting is James Monroe would have gotten all the electoral votes as well. James Monroe was gonna get 232 when he ran in 1820, but out of respect for Washington, there was one holdout from New Hampshire. The elector was like, "All right, I'm going to hold off, so that way there's only one
Well,
George
and
Washington."
that's something to keep in mind. Washington garners, so much of this like respect in the country. Like even at that time, that's why they wanted him really, because they knew if he was such a hero, he was such a larger than life character, even by this time, that people were just going to like respect him and also like listen to him just because he was George Washington. They mention that a lot in all the readings I did, and even watching some of those movies that they show him. Like this, his presence. He was tall for the time. He was over 6 feet tall. He was like 220 pounds. They always talked about his strength. He was like a really strong guy, like outdoorsman type of individual. So when he came into a room, he did command a type of presence. His
Sounds like a
eyes were very
WWE.
he sounds sounds like a type of wrestler, right? Comes in and he actually always had a full head of hair, which is very unique for the time. Right, he powdered it because he had kind of a reddish brown hair, so he was kind of like a ginger almost. So, but yeah, but he powdered his hair. Okay, he had like those very blue eyes, and he just commanded a presence, and that respect carried way past his death, like you were saying. That well, we can't have anyone have the same amount of more same electoral votes as Washington. That's why I believe as a general, as a commander in chief, no one can outrank him. I know there's something to do with that we can talk
Yeah,
about a little bit later.
yeah,
When it was such a big deal when FDR ran for a third term, oh, he's breaking the precedent set by Washington.
yeah.
That all goes back to just that respect that people have for him, really, even to this day.
So what's interesting? Let's talk, since you mentioned FDR. FDR obviously ran and won 4 different terms. He never served a fourth term because he died, which could be a podcast in itself. But why did Washington step down after 2 terms? I mean, this is the guy that's revered by everyone. What started to happen towards the end?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. Well, he wanted to step down. If you read any biographies on him,
The
he wanted to
first
step
one,
down after the first term. He had
yeah.
no interest of going back. The only reason he stays is because of all the political infighting, particularly Jefferson and Hamilton.
Hmm.
He just stayed to kind of keep things together because he didn't believe in political parties. He didn't believe in that sort of system. But he wanted to have he definitely wanted a strong central government. That was important to show that this experiment called the United States would last. So that's really why he stuck around. But yeah, the second reason why he left, I'll let you go more detail about that. But yeah, basically it was a couple reasons, right? Where it was his health. His health wasn't the best,
Yeah.
and also he wasn't as well liked after the whole Jace Treaty
Absolutely.
fiasco.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of like you said, if one thing is, first of all, talk about, like all stars for his cabinet. I mean,
Oh yeah.
this guy's got, he's loaded. He's got Henry Knox. He's got, obviously Jefferson,
Who
Secretary
he
of
wound up
State,
hating afterwards. Like him
Hamilton.
and Knox didn't. No,
Yeah.
Hamilton. He always stayed friendly, but even after that whole affair, which we can do stuff on
Yeah.
Hamilton. But
What is the thing?
Knox, he wound up having a falling out with Knox.
Yep. And Jefferson quit on him. I mean, Jefferson literally
Yeah,
quit this,
yeah.
Secretary of
Well,
State. He's like,
Yeah,
yeah, I can't.
he wanted to be president. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he hated Hamilton.
Yeah, and that was the thing, and everyone kind of felt in the inner circle that Washington was always, back in Hamilton,
He,
and
which he would
Hamilton,
do. Yeah.
yeah, and Hamilton, he's kind of a British guy, more or less, and very much pro strong federal government, and some people specifically, or especially Thomas Jefferson, very much against that.
Well, again, what we got to give like the people listening a little bit of like
Yeah.
chronological pretense, I guess here. Like what's going on basically is the French Revolution, right?
Hmm.
So you have that going on, and the French Revolution, the like revolutionaries, I guess, are asking for help. They want the Americans to get involved, saying, "We helped you get your independence, now help ours." And Washington's like, "No, no, no, we're not getting involved in this." And Hamilton backed that, and then Jefferson wanted us to get involved in some way, basically. And
Yeah.
that spiraled basically this whole like, who are we going to side with in these next coming years? We can side with the British or we side with the French, and that's basically broken, and that made it obvious when the whole Jace Treaty came out.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jay Street, just kind of a little background. The British and the French are fighting. Another again because they kind of like do that in history. So the British and the French are fighting, and kind of as Tom was saying, there's this idea of, well, obviously the French supported us in the fight against the British. We should support the French. And Washington's kind of like, yeah, there's no way we could support anyone. We're a new nation, and we don't have our stuff together yet. We can't really support anybody. So he chooses to stay neutral. And um, with that in mind, what's interesting is this is kind of the beginning of what happens in the War of 1812. Is that you have the British are seizing our ships. So all of our ships that are going to France are being stopped by the British. And ironically, also all those ships going to Britain, trading with Britain, are being stopped by the French. But um, that's one issue. Another issue that's kind of happening here is that after the American Revolutionary War, which ended in technically in 1783, we're talking like 1790s now, and the British never actually left. They still have a lot of forts
Yeah, they're
located.
still there, especially on the frontier.
Yep, they still have these British forts, and they're technically in the United States. So,
Yeah. And they're
um,
also encouraging. I'm sorry to cut you off. They're
yeah, go
encouraging
ahead.
the
Of course.
native. They're encouraging the Native Americans to attack the frontiersmen, the settlers out there. Which is just they're doing it on purpose. They're hey, go attack those American colonists over there, and they're enticing them, giving them goods to go in and do these raids on these settlements. And Washington's like, "What are you doing? You're supposed to be gone, and now you're encouraging raids, and my people are being killed." I think they're saying there's over 1,500 people were killed during that time in the span of like a year. And there was a lot of outcry for
Absolutely.
what's going on, like how are we letting the British still do this to us? We beat them. They're supposed to be gone. Why are they still here?
Yep. And so as this is happening, essentially, Washington decides that he is going again, trying to stay neutral. Playing the middle ground here. He sent John Jay to England to try to come up with a treaty, which ultimately was really twofold. I mean, one, he wanted the British to leave those forts, in the American frontier, because it was kind of embarrassing that we still had the enemy living amongst us. The other issue was to have the British stop trading with us. Sorry, wrong. Sorry, to stop taking our ships and seizing our sailors. So Jay goes, and when Jay comes back, this infamous Jay's Treaty, he does secure the frontier. The British are going to leave the forts. However, he is unable to get a, I guess, a complete guarantee that our ships are going to be left alone on the seas. So no freedom of the
Yeah,
seas.
it's kind of a gentleman's agreement, but that's it. There wasn't any like
Exactly.
actual written saying we'll leave them alone.
Yeah, and but also England said that they will remain and will become rather our will have a most favorable, trading status with England, and many people saw that as a betrayal. I mean, again, it's only been what, like 15, not even 10 years or so since
Yeah.
the war ended. So a lot of people died in that war. So like, what do you mean we're going to be favorable trade partners with
Oh yeah.
Britain? I
There
thought
was
we were
still a lot of bad feelings and everything. Yeah.
absolutely. And the idea was like, well, I thought we were staying neutral. What's going on with that? Um, so needless to say, um, when Jay came back, there was Washington was kind of viewed as you screwed up, Washington, like you betrayed our nation
Yeah.
because you kind of sided with our old enemy, and my grandfather died, or my father died, or my husband died in that war, and all of a sudden you had people, with
For the first
signs,
time, yeah,
yeah,
criticizing him. Yeah.
criticizing him, and
Newspapers. Yeah.
yeah, go ahead, and
He hated the press. Yeah.
yeah. And that was the thing. He was kind of like, wait a second. Like I'm already secured, my for posterity. Like I'm
Yeah, well,
George Washington.
put yourself in his shoes. He's George Washington. Like he's the man.
Yep.
He's the first everything. Everyone loves him. And now this after Jay's treaty comes out, now they're actually starting to speak out against him a little bit. And he's like, "What is going on? Really? Like you love me one day, and then we have this little treaty, which is actually benefiting the country. It avoids war with Britain, which is always a good thing. And yet he's now they're talking bad about him. And Jefferson's outright speaking negatively about him in the newspapers, in the press. And it's just he's just like, you know what? I'm done. He's like, I
Yep.
don't need this anymore. I'm done. And he just was like, between that and his health, this wasn't something he wanted to really deal with anymore. And he also knew that he was probably going to. He was older now. So he didn't want to die in office. I know that was a big thing because he was afraid that would set the precedent. Also, that the presidency would be for life, and he
Yep.
really wanted that not to be the case.
And it's interesting about what you said about presidency for life. I mean, when he became president, the first thing that Congress discussed under a new constitution was what they should call
Yeah,
George
what's your call?
Washington, like
Yeah,
His Excellency. That's kind of one of the things John Adams wanted. They should
John
call
Adams
him.
wanted that. Yeah,
They should call him His Excellency, and then it kind of came down to he said, well, like I kind of preside over the government. You could just call me Mr. President, and he kind of came up with that.
yeah. And again, it's
Very
one of
humble.
these precedents. Everything that he did, that's what he was a very humble guy for the most part. For everything that I've read, again, we don't
Yeah.
know him personally, but
Yep.
everything that you've read, every time you've seen him portrayed, he's very humble, soft spoken. Like you can never hear like the things he would say, and everybody did love him. Like even Jefferson, who didn't like his politics, had respect for the man.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and from what he accomplished, he would never say anything negative about that. He just said, "Listen, his time has passed. He's making these bad decisions now." And he blamed a lot on Hamilton too. Like they just had this hatred for one another.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so if we're trying to talk about like his legacy as president, so he decides basically, and the way he quits is also very interesting. I mean, he essentially writes a letter to the American people,
Yeah,
right? And he publishes this letter in the newspapers, and it's an interesting thing because it sets a precedent for the United States, specifically for foreign policy, for the longest
really.
time.
To what 1941?
Yeah.
Like,
So, um, and basically, Tom, you want to get into that? What does he technically say in his farewell address?
well, he says a lot of things, but the main thing has to do with foreign policy, and a lot of people are saying it's a very anti-French, which it could be. All right, he was not very favorable to the French Washington, but he was basically saying, do not get involved in European wars. That Europe is going to be fighting wars. All right, that we can trade with everybody. All right, we can trade with them, trade with everyone, actually, not just people in Europe. He was very big on that. But his main thing was like, listen, do not get involved in European wars. They're going to fight in wars. We have to remain neutral. Because if we get involved, we're just going to get entangled. We're going to be on one side, and then that side is going to change. He says it's too much of a mess there, and that was the big thing about not getting involved in World War One. Why we took so long for us to get involved there, and then a lot of people got mad whenever we did get involved. And obviously, a big reason why we don't get involved in the Second World War until 1941, when the bombs fall in Pearl Harbor, and
Yeah.
that policy of isolationism really lasts until those first bombs drop. After that, America changes. That's a whole other podcast or a whole other conversation. I'm not getting into that now. But
Yeah.
yeah, that lasts all the way really until the 1940s. It's crazy when you think about it.
Yep, absolutely. And actually, even till 1940s, everyone always kind of quoted that. That was
Yeah,
Washington's
Washington.
warning.
It was always about that. Yep,
And it's
that was
also
the reason
ironic.
why.
Yeah, it's ironic because one of the other warnings that Washington had was that, the United States should definitely try to stay away from political bickering and political parties. And
Yeah, that
ironically,
didn't
the
happen.
first political parties happened, under his very nose. Obviously, you have, his part of the Federalist Party, which is the only party that existed at the time. But when Jefferson quits as his Secretary of State, he forms his own political party, the Democratic Republicans, later known simply as Republicans. Um, so, the party was already happening at that particular moment, and it's interesting that he's
Yeah,
trying to say, let's not do that, let's not do that.
well, that's just going to happen though. Like in a democracy, and again, this is all new, but that's what's going to happen. You're going to have these political parties. You're going to have disagreements. That's what they're talking about in the Federalist Papers, right? That they're going to
Yep.
have these disagreements, but it's a good thing. That's what Hamilton and stuff is saying. This is how you get like thought. This is how you get change. This is how you have this, constructive debate. I don't think they're, would like some of the politics stuff that was happening now, but really it was happening back then too, like the scandals and stuff like that.
Oh,
They
yeah.
all knew about those sorts of things, and
Yep. Yep.
whether they decided to tell people about it or not was dependent on not if they're going to get votes or not and get their agendas passed. So it's
Well,
really the
actually,
same thing.
yep. And what's interesting about Washington too is, when you talk about when this guy became president, the Constitution is new. He's the very first president of the United States. Articles of Confederation was the first government that the United States operated under directly after and during the American Revolutionary War, and that was not necessarily working out. And mainly because the states kind of acted like they were separate little countries as opposed to the United States. So when the Constitution was written, George Washington steps in. Um, as a leader of a nation that is ruled by a document, which is unprecedented in itself. And, he's not really sure exactly what he has to do. That's kind of part of his legacy when you talk about George Washington, is he takes his job very seriously in that, he's an executive branch, which means he's supposed to execute or carry out the laws passed by Congress. And, he's got his big test, shortly after becoming president, namely in order to make money for a new nation to bring in revenue, and that's part of Hamilton's plan, they raised taxes on the one thing that Americans love, which is whiskey.
Yep.
Right. So they raised
Love
these
their
taxes.
alcohol.
Right. Yeah, they love the alcohol, right? So they raised taxes on whiskey and alcohol, and
And
in
that was
Pennsylvania.
Hamilton's plan, I believe, right? Wasn't it Hamilton
Yeah, it
wanted to
was.
do that?
It was Hamilton. Yep.
And Jefferson was against it. This was like the beginning of them really not getting along. That and the bank, they didn't. That was where
Absolutely.
they were like
Yep.
apart.
And that was kind of the thing because also Jefferson thought that you talk about distillers in the rural area of Pennsylvania. These are the farmers, Jefferson people, that they're going to be hurt. So a lot of these distillers got really upset, and they started kind of became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. And they're like, this is taxation without representation. They're basically saying that, look, we substituted England for another tyranny.
Yeah, for
Um,
the
Absolutely, yeah. So Washington's kind of being well, not just criticized. I mean, he's like seen as a
they're
villain.
testing. They're testing to see if this government can even relax, like
Exactly. Like,
survive.
what is he going to do? Like, what are you going to do about
Yeah,
it? And this is interesting because Washington, in a very unpopular at the time, but really kind of creates what the presidency really is about today. I mean, this guy says, no, you're going to listen to the laws passed by Congress because it's not taxation without representation, because Congress is made up of representatives.
yeah,
Therefore, right, your representatives agreed to this, so you're going to
yeah.
pay these taxes. And then what he does is, interestingly enough, again, this is the president. So he takes one part of that paragraph in the Constitution that describes his job very seriously, and that is the commander in chief. So he creates an army, basically, calls in a militia from
And
nearby
they all
states.
joined just because it's Washington.
Yeah, and
That's the
he
crazy thing too.
rides out of the front of the militia. He's like, we're going to ride, into Pennsylvania and squash this rebellion. And he doesn't even ride all the way. Like he goes on for like, a
No.
day or something, and then he goes
Once
back.
they hear it's him there, because he tries getting like the states to do something. The states are like, we're not getting involved in this, and
Yeah.
and they don't want to get involved. So he's like, fine, I'll raise it myself. And really, just because it's George Washington, people join up and they just go there. And I don't think they open fire or anything like that. It's more
No,
they
no,
captured a
actually,
bunch.
yeah, they captured
They
a bunch of
captured.
people, and the rebellion just ended.
They're like, you know what? Never mind.
Yeah, but what's interesting with that is that here you have Washington actually turns a paragraph in a new document that forms this nation and creates context to it. He kind of puts it into practice. Like, this is my job as president. My job is to make sure that the laws passed by Congress are carried out. Great legacy in that respect. And another part of his legacy is, the creation of the cabinet that we mentioned before. This is a guy that, he's a general, but he's not a politician. And what kind of makes him a good leader is the fact that he surrounded himself with really good people.
He
And
realized he needed that, what like Roosevelt later called that brain trust, right? He
yep,
needed those ideas from other people. It wasn't just going to be him, which again is a big deal at the time. He's not just saying, "Well, I'm the divine ruler. Whatever I decide is going to be right." No, he knows there's going to be some things I'm going to need some guidance on. I'm not an expert on everything, and just that shows his humility. His humility, right there. I don't know everything. I need help. And that's a big deal.
absolutely. Yep. Um, so one thing I think we kind of need to talk about when we talk about who was George Washington, his legacy and whatnot. I mean, kind of growing up and how that translates later on. Uh, growing up, he was a surveyor of land. He was a land surveyor. That's kind of how he made his money.
We got to go even
Um,
farther than that. I'm sorry to interrupt you there,
yeah, go
Pete,
go.
but I remember I was reading some stuff about him, and like he had like a bunch of brothers. He was like this youngest brother,
Hmm.
and when his father died, this was something that Washington always like felt very like self conscious about. His older brothers all went to England to study. He didn't because his father died when he was too young. So he actually never finished. He only had was like a grade school education,
Yep.
grade school level education, but he was a great surveyor, like what you were saying of land. But that
Yep.
was it. So you think about like this guy who didn't, and he was always very like embarrassed about that because that was like a big
Yeah,
thing. Like
actually, he
higher
used to have a lot
circles.
of. They said he had a lot of books in French in his library at
Yeah,
Mount Vernon. Just so when people stopped by, they would see that he had all these books in French, but he
yeah.
never actually knew how to read them.
A lot of him is about the image. Like I said, he had this presence, and he wanted to really project that presence. And yeah, I don't think he didn't read a lot of that stuff. It's just that he had like he was a writer too, and none of his work that he wrote apparently like survived. They said it had like no humor in it. It was just wasn't basically well done, but because
Yeah.
he didn't have that like really higher education that a lot of the other big shots, even in Virginia, had at that time.
What's interesting is when you study, about Washington. when he was a soldier for the Redcoats during the French and Indian War, which
Oh
happened
yeah,
before the American Revolutionary War. They claim that he's the one that started
started it.
World
Yeah,
War.
yeah.
Yeah,
He started the French Indian War. Yeah,
yeah, because you started the first shots in the skirmish when he found the French. But what's interesting
they
is,
killed someone. They killed like I'm sorry. They killed like some
yeah, they
like
killed like
this
a
one
French diplomat
a French
or
noble. Yeah, I have
exactly,
yeah. They killed him, and they're like, "Why did you kill him?" He's like, "Oh, it was a miscommunication with my interpreter."
exactly.
And then it just became this whole big thing. The French were like, no, we're not, and then it became the war. Yeah, he was blamed for it. It took him years to like regain his confidence in the British Army after that.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah,
interesting is because they supposedly, I listened to one podcast once that stated that this French person is like laying on the ground and like pleading for mercy, and Washington didn't really understand him, which again
yeah,
goes back to this whole uneducated part, of Washington. I mean, the guy made his money because he married rich. Let's face it.
yeah. He did have money himself, but
Yeah, but
most
I
of it
mean,
was married rich. And then when he was the only surviving person too, I think like his brothers died, his aunt died. That's how he got Mount Vernon. He was leasing it from her, and she
yeah,
passes away, so he gets it. And then Martha Washington was like filthy rich. Yeah,
yeah. So he, he married Martha and he made his money, even though he was like in love with somebody else. That was like a whole thing too. He
yeah.
was
His best friend's wife. He was in love with.
Yeah, he was a player. He would like, write her like love letters, which some of them actually still survive.
Yeah, a
So
few
he's
of them did,
writing
but
love letters to his best friend's,
that was
like
before he
war
met Martha,
girlfriend.
I believe. Because
Yeah,
I think when he met Martha, he did fall in love with her. They said there was genuine loving um, relationship between the two. And she was apparently like very, I mean, she was rich, but this has come out lately that this is going to be kind of odd sounding, but she was very like beautiful. That's what they were talking about. Like a young Martha Washington. You always used to see Martha Washington. She's like that old lady type of picture
yeah,
you'd seen. But apparently when she was young, she was like only like 26, I think, when they met and when they got married. Same thing with him. And she was apparently very beautiful. So she had a lot of suitors, and she chose Washington basically because had that presence. Here comes this like 6'4", 6'5", 220 muscle bound, general or army personnel, and she fell in love with him basically.
yeah. And it's interesting to say they never had any children.
No, well, she had
She
from a
did, yeah.
previous marriage, and there's a couple of things about that. They think that her last pregnancy, her last child she gave birth to, complicated thing made it difficult for her to conceive again. And then Washington had smallpox, which left his face scarred up, and they
Hmm.
think that's a very common thing that could have caused infertility, having him be infertile
Yeah.
also. Um, maybe just a combination of the two. They never had, and they realized pretty early on they weren't going to have children of their own, but he did raise her children like his own.
Did you ever see there was a show once of like what they would look like? They recreated them.
Yeah,
Um,
based on yeah, and you'd be
yeah.
surprised like what if they had the faces off or something like that. Yeah,
Yep. Yeah. And the Washington face had a lot of smallpox, like a lot of
yeah.
scarring on it and stuff, which is interesting.
Also common for the time, but
Yeah, and I think I'm almost positive Washington had a death mask. Was a death mask or was it when he was still alive when they made the mask on him?
they did that when they did that right. Yeah, towards the end, or in Lincoln's case, it was after he died. But they usually do that beforehand. Yeah,
Yeah, because Jefferson he was alive. I mean, when they were doing this, he was still alive, and they would put this plaster on his face to try to get it, like a life mask, and something went wrong, and he almost suffocated, and the guy almost died. Um,
yeah. That's how they used to make those like the presidential bust that you see everywhere. And
yeah,
that's why how do we know what they look like? Well, this is how we know. Just for the
yeah, which is
clarify a
interesting.
few things there. Oh
Talking
yeah,
about looks too for Washington is the infamous Washington's teeth.
oh yeah.
No, they were not made out of wood. What's kind of gross in a sense, though, is and eerie actually. They said that they were made his teeth. His dentures were very painful to him, so he used to never smile because of the fact that it
Yeah,
was
and
so
he
painful.
used to take opium to make the pain go away.
Yeah, I mean, if you see them, if you ever go to Mount Vernon, they actually have his teeth on display, and they
Yeah,
look
it's
like.
supposed to
I mean, you're putting like a robotic thing in your
be.
mouth, but
I think at his inauguration, he had one of his own teeth actually left. That was it.
it's crazy. But they discovered a lot of the teeth. Some of them were from ivory and cow teeth and
Oh, yeah.
lead and
I
other
know what
things.
you're
But
going to say. Yeah, go ahead, say it.
yeah,
I know what you're going to.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Where'd they come from?
Slaves.
Yeah, they came from his slaves.
Yeah,
He would take the teeth
insane.
from his slaves and then use them in his own mouth.
Absolutely, which is insane.
So I guess that can be kind of our door to talk
That's a
about,
segue, right?
Washington. A little segue there. Look at there's a podcast word. Okay, of our Washington and slavery, which is pretty complicated. It's a very debated issue, and it's also a pretty complicated issue. So, um, Washington slavery, because I believe from what it does change over time.
Oh yeah.
What his view of it, and I almost reading some of the things that I've read about it, it's almost like he does have some regret that he didn't do more sooner when it comes to that.
And I feel like a lot of them did. When they wrote their papers and their letters, they wrote him. They always wrote two copies
Yeah,
because these founding
yeah.
fathers
They
basically.
understood what they knew it was an issue.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and what's interesting is everything they wrote down, they knew was going to be kept for future generations. So none of them wanted to look like like d bags in a sense. They wanted to be perceived as okay, like this is a big moral question, and a lot of them, Jefferson, obviously, infamously, and so did
yeah.
Washington, were very much like, well, this isn't right. But Washington is the only president from that batch of first five, founding father presidents to actually free his slaves. None of the other five did that. Actually, a lot of them sold the slaves because they were like broke by the end
Well,
of their
they could
life.
make money. Yeah, well, they did. Yeah, because they were so hard to get slaves too, for the most
Yep.
part at that time. So if you wanted them, you had to buy ones that were already around and stuff like that. And Washington was against that. Even when he had slaves, again, we're not defending this at all. Okay,
Yeah.
any form of slavery is just disgusting. But Washington did start to dislike it more and more. But even when he had slaves, and he did see them as property. That was especially early on in his career when he had them. They were property. He would keep track of how many he had. They said there was conflicting reports of how well he treated them. They were always treated just enough, but they were also like they cost money. So he wanted to make sure that they were alive. He would get them inoculated for smallpox and stuff like that. And like, oh, that's so nice. But really, he's investing in his business. That's how he saw it. So
Absolutely.
he wasn't really doing it as, oh, I want to help these people. But the big thing he was against, and he was against this pretty early on for everything I saw, it was splitting up the families. He didn't think that was a good idea. But again, it was like almost a business. He's like, well, they're not going to work as hard if I split them up for their families. But if they think I'm going to split them up for their families, they might work harder to ensure that doesn't happen. So that
Yeah.
was always like a thing with him. So he was against it. He didn't like to do it, and he very rarely did it. But kind of having that threat out there is what he felt was he didn't want them to know he was against that. It was more of like, well, if they think it's going to happen, then they're going to work hard to make sure it doesn't happen. So again, he's looking at the bottom line.
Yeah, and it's interesting, just kind of bring it up whenever I talk to my students about slavery. You know, a lot of the slave owners, that's where their money was in. I mean, slaves were property, and it was, if you owned 100 slaves, you were filthy rich
Oh yeah,
because your money was in the slaves, in a sense, in owning that property. Um, so protecting your slaves was, ensuring your property was safeguarded, which is also, why it was so difficult to try to emancipate the slaves later on because, how do you pay for how would government pay for property if they were to possess that property, repossess that property, which is a whole another podcast in itself. But Tom, you want to talk a little bit about his infamous or famous rather freeing of his slaves, how that worked?
well, he does talk about, and I found some stuff interesting on that he was talking to his secretary one time and told him how much he disliked slavery and he would get rid of slavery. He wanted, apparently, he did want to say something about it during his second presidential term. Right before he left, he was going to say something negative about slavery and kind of
Hmm.
start that discussion. But he basically decided it's just going to create more problems than what it's going to be worth. And he actually tells friends like, listen, this is going to start a civil war. This is going to start a civil war in the country, which obviously does take place. But basically, he writes into his will, right, that when he dies, his slaves will be free after his wife passes away, right?
Yep.
Because he still wants her taken care of. And also, there's some other stuff that he knew a lot of his slaves were his, but some of them were part of also belonged to his wife, and they were like married and stuff. And he knew none of them would leave anyway because
Hmm.
they weren't going to leave their children or their families. Then he was aware of that, but he did say that, like, yeah, at the time of his death, at the time of Martha's death, their slaves would be freed. And his personal slave, Hercules, ran away way before this. They never found him. He ran off to
Yep.
Philadelphia, never found him.
But
Yeah,
didn't he want to free him?
there was like they say he wanted to, but again, this guy was like he had a chance to be free, and he's like, I'm not going to wait for this guy to die. He says he's
Yeah.
going to free me, but how many times? But they
Yeah.
probably told him you're going to be freed one day. Well, I might not. What if I die before he dies, or what if something else happens? What if the people that take over the estate decide not to free me? If I have a chance to leave now, I'm going to leave now. And that's what he did. And Washington is also the president that put in the Fugitive Slave Act. he put that into place.
Yep.
So I mean, this kind of shows there he regrets it, but it's still his part of his legacy. It's something that has to be discussed, at least acknowledged.
And I think it's also interesting in the sense that, Washington said that, he freed his slaves, but they're not free until his wife passes,
Yeah,
So it's kind of, it's interesting because now, this is public knowledge. So, you now have his wife living, amongst people that essentially would benefit from her death,
yeah.
because they know that if she was to die, they would be free.
Not
So
only free, but they also get money. Like they were going to get money
yeah,
from the estate to like go and start their lives.
yep.
And I think they were still getting money up until the 1830s. They were still getting like payments, more
Again,
or less.
unprecedented, and the only
Yeah.
president to have done that. Which,
So yeah, they were going to benefit, by being free, but also going to benefit financially. Like they were going to have money coming in to themselves, and then that they could use to buy land, buy whatever. And so yeah, her death was very intriguing for them. Yeah, definitely
yeah,
a plus.
which is also why she actually freed them before she died.
Yeah, I think she
She,
was getting scared. She had to be
yeah,
getting
she
scared.
was literally getting scared. She was like, "Yeah,
She's
we're
probably
gonna,
getting those dirty looks.
we're just gonna let
When are
this
you gonna
one."
croak, old lady? When are you gonna croak?
Yeah, so she does free them. But another thing that's interesting is there's some slaves on that plantation that did not belong to Washington.
Yeah,
They came to the plantation through Martha's previous marriage, and therefore they are only owned by Martha and that estate. So he doesn't free those people. He only frees the slaves that he particularly owned, which is an interesting thing.
yeah, that he can
Um,
do. Yeah,
yep, only what he could do. So, before we kind of stop talking about Washington, I just read recently that protesters tore down Washington's statue, right? And set fire to his head, and that's kind of interesting. Again, that's kind of could become a very political topic, and I think one day we probably will address, just kind of the impetus behind Confederate statues being put up, and talk a little bit about a history of what that, why they are put up and all that stuff. But more or less, I would have to say that Washington had kind of survived history in a very positive light, wouldn't you say?
yeah. I mean, I think everybody knows him. Like
Yep.
even my son knows everything about. I was looking at some of the stuff earlier. He's like, "Oh yeah, George Washington, first president, he's on the dollar bill." Like he's just spewing all these facts. I'm like, "I never told you this." It's just ingrained in American culture. George Washington, father of our country, all that sort of stuff. And I think he did a lot of good that definitely deserves him to have some positive light. Like it's very important that we talk about you know, the black eyes part of his
Yeah.
administration and things that he did that was not, morally, he wasn't this morally perfect person by any means.
Yep.
But I think the legacy that he has, at least some of it was definitely, lack of it, earned to a certain degree. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he kind of. Plus, we didn't. I mean, wasn't it Washington that gave us Thanksgiving?
Yeah, he was the first one to put that in
Right.
place. Not the actual date. I know that changes a couple of times, but he
Yeah.
does. He does give us Thanksgiving. That we're going to have this annual day of a Thanksgiving to give thanks to all that we have. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
like a big. It was a big thing. It became a very popular holiday, obviously.
And it was almost a
Way
turkey. It was almost a turkey, not turkey. Yeah, that was almost our national bird, turkey, because
That's
of
not what Franklin wanted. Franklin
Franklin.
wanted it.
Yeah. I think Washington again, and he's very much taught in schools again with both of our young kids. He is the founding father of the nation. As you kind of started this podcast, he was the first in many things. How did it go again? First
That
in
was it.
peace.
First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen.
That's what it was. Yep.
I think that's also. I thought that's got to be on his grave. I think too by Mount Vernon, or at least like on the
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I don't. I don't
reading that.
want to say
That
for
was part
sure,
of
but
his like. That was part of his eulogy.
yep. So
It's also I found
go
out. Sorry, Pete. Was
no go.
something interesting that they changed. His birthday is actually wasn't February 22nd. That like
They ch-
that's what it's assigned as. His actual birthday was February 11th. But when the colony switched the calendars
huh,
um, to the Julian calendar away from the King George calendar, it moved 11 days. So he just kept that new date. So he
that's
changed.
crazy.
He actually changed it. Actually, that was like a holiday for years. It was still it got more from the President's Day, but
I was
Washington's
gonna
birthday
say,
used to
then
be
now you have mattress sales.
yeah, mattress sales and like car sales, right? All this stuff. We had like those guys on Route 17 dressing up as Washington and Lincoln, right? Come buy a car. But yeah,
Yeah,
but that was like it was a big deal. Like
that's
that he
crazy.
changed his birthday again. He's showing if I'm changing mine, it's not a big deal if you do yours. Like if Washington's doing it, we can do it too. So again, he's setting that precedent. He's setting an example. They got people
Yep,
to like go along with it.
absolutely. And I think before we finish this one up, any fun facts that we have? Gotta get a list of some fun
I
facts
did
about
find one that
Washington.
was pretty interesting. That Washington was actually a big animal person, right? So
Hmm.
he had pretty much every type of dog you could imagine he had at one time or another. But he was also a breeder, not so much of dogs, but of he was one of the big supporters of breeding mules, like the cross between like the donkey and the horse, right? And that was like a big deal. He thought this is a great pack animal. This animal can like change, can do a lot. If it can change off of the farms, and he was the one that really brought that or to the colonies, and then later on to like the United States. And so, if the reason that like there's so many mules or that they became known as like a pack animal was really because of individuals like Washington. He was known for that. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, and also, before his death, by 1799, it says that Washington's whiskey distillery, was producing about 11,000 gallons, and therefore making it the largest whiskey distillery in America. So towards the end, of his life, he kind of got into making whiskey.
Well, he knew it was in demand. I mean, remember he goes and he saw that people really start a revolution over the stuff, right? So he saw that
Yeah,
firsthand. So he's like, hey, maybe I should get involved in this. Didn't they a couple years ago found like a recipe or something? Came out with that. Like I don't remember.
yeah. Actually,
I remember hearing something
his
about that. Right? His descendants.
yeah, you could visit his distillery, in Mount Vernon right now, and they actually like give you his whiskey, which is interesting.
That's different.
And it's used the same exact what's what I'm looking for, ingredients, as he would have. Um, what else? Anything else
I
that we
found
found?
one in the bicentennial. They remember like in 1976. That's the bicentennial for those of you math majors out there. And what was going on is like it was very pro America. Everything was America, America, America in 1976. So I found something that they actually the military changed his rank. Like he retired as lieutenant general, and then later like 3-star generals and 5-star generals like surpassed that technically in rank. And they didn't want that. They say they would not be the United States military if not for Washington. So they gave him a new rank, and it's a rank that no one can ever reach, and it's a rank that can never be surpassed today. It was called General of the Armies of the United States. So, and it's a title that only Washington could ever hold. So they basically made that on purpose, again, to make a legacy with him, right? That no one can ever have a higher ranking than Washington in the military ever. So I'm sure that could be like a Jeopardy question at some point.
Yeah, and he never chopped down a cherry tree.
No, that they kind of made that up after his death, right?
Yeah, they did. Founding Myths is a great book. I forgot the author's name, but essentially, first of all, there was no cherry trees on the plantation when he was growing up, so that
That's
can't
gonna
even
make it,
be
yeah,
remotely a debatable
that's gonna make
topic.
it hard.
Yeah, um, that he was a dog lover, like you said. He didn't have wooden teeth. That's the only other one.
I know
He's also, what else? What do
I
you
know
got?
John Adams made Washington commander in chief when he was president to like
He
command
did.
the army. He didn't do anything with it. Nothing actually happened. But yeah, so actually that was the only time that the commander in chief was not the executive power. Like the president didn't have that power. He
Yep.
gave it to Washington. He's like, you did such a good job with it. Here you go. I'm going to still give it to you. And
Yep.
Washington's like, oh
And then
man, I can't get
interestingly
out.
enough, yeah, he's like, I'm just gonna give it. I'm gonna give it to Hamilton. I'm pretty sure he put Hamilton as second in
Yeah, I
command, and
think he
that
did. Yeah,
caused the
and then
whole.
they had the whole that caused them more problems.
Yeah. So I guess that brings us to the end of our first ever podcast. Um, I guess it's we're starting out. This is the beginning. Certainly
Yeah,
at the
well,
end.
we started with the beginning in a way, right? No, Washington's kind of
That's
the
right.
beginning of a lot of things, and just a lot of precedents. Hopefully, this podcast that we did, is only the beginning, and it sets a lot of precedents. Okay, positive ones,
Yeah.
hopefully. But yeah,
Hopefully. And then we'll see what else pops in our head for our next one. But until next week, I guess thanks for listening.
yeah. Thanks for
Right,
listening.
Tom?
Yeah, thanks for listening. This is Tom, I guess, signing off.
Right. Yeah, and Peter signing off. Till next week, guys. Thanks for listening. hope everyone enjoyed our podcast. And if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.